They say some old records carry more silence than paper, and it was precisely in the midst of that silence, between pages stiffened by cold and ink that no longer held its own color, that the researcher found the line that would change everything. Before anything else, however, he left a brief, almost technical note, as someone who merely marks a reference point. Comment which city you're watching from, and what time it is there now. Then he returned to what truly mattered. The sentence was at the bottom margin of the Crowthorn County Register, dated 1884, a handwriting that did not match that of the official clerks, slanted, restrained, as if written by someone who did not want to be seen writing it. It said, "The widow of Crowthorn went down to the basement before nightfall. By dawn, 27 names were missing." The county of Crowthorn at that time was a rural community scattered among damp hills and trails that disappeared into wooded valleys. It was a region where the morning fog took hours to lift, where wooden houses survived only through constant repairs, and where every family knew the history of the other, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Survival there depended on cooperation, and the winters had a habit of reminding everyone of that with severity. The involuntary protagonist of that forgotten record was Eleanor Whitford, known in the following decade simply as the widow of Crowthorn Hollow, a 38-year-old woman at the time, silent, proud, carrying a kind of firmness that did not need to be announced. Her husband, Thomas Whitford, had died 2 winters earlier, crushed by a log during the construction of an improvised bridge over Lower Brink Creek. The tragedy isolated her, and although the community maintained respect, there was no longer a constant circulation of voices in the Whitford house, only the sound of wind passing through the cracks. The family home was a long structure built in 1851, with crooked beams and a deep basement used both for storing tools and for protecting food supplies during winter. Since Thomas's death, however, the basement was rarely mentioned, neither by her nor by the neighbors. It was as though that space had acquired its own weight, a kind of mute presence made of memories and a past no one dared to disturb. The 27 missing men mentioned in the record were not outsiders or lost travelers. They were residents of the county, loggers, farmers, 2 blacksmith brothers, 3 young apprentices from the sawmill, and even a teacher from the old Crowthorn Ridge School, all men between 17 and 50-something years old. All last seen in late October of that year, and all connected, in one way or another, to the hills surrounding the Whitford property. There were no official documents in the main archives reporting an organized search, a police inquiry, or a formal accusation. Instead, there were loose annotations, scattered testimonies collected decades later, and fragments of letters suggesting a growing uneasiness in those weeks. Records indicate the region faced an early arrival of winter, with longer nights and a collective sense that something, difficult to name, felt out of place. The researcher responsible for reconstructing the case noticed that the sentence about the missing men stood alone, like an open wound among bureaucratic paragraphs. There was no signature, no reason for it to be there, and, curiously, no later attempts to erase it. It seemed to have been left by someone who wanted the annotation to survive time, even if only as an echo. More unsettling, however, was the detail found on the following page. A torn edge, as if someone had removed something, a note, an additional sheet, or perhaps a list of names, before the document was archived. The removal was not catalogued. There was no justification, only the empty space where something once existed. It is in this emptiness that this account begins, because when one tries to reconstruct the story of the 27 missing from Crowthorn Hollow, all that exists is what survived on paper and what was torn away from it. And even so, despite the lack of official records, one truth becomes clear from the first surviving document. The Whitford basement was the last confirmed location before the disappearance, and for reasons even the early chroniclers could not comprehend, no one, absolutely no one, mentioned seeing Eleanor Whitford the following morning. The surviving records do not reveal much about the days preceding the collective disappearance, but the collection of testimonies gathered over the decades allows the reconstruction of the community's routine in late October 1884 with reasonable accuracy. During that period, the county went through what they called Preparation Week, when each family checked supplies, sealed cracks, and reinforced vulnerable structures before the arrival of strong winds. The region was known for its unstable climate. Autumn could last weeks or disappear overnight. That year, it barely arrived before being swallowed by cold. The missing loggers were working in the northern woods, near the border of Bracken Valley. It was a disciplined group, mostly young men who took turns transporting logs to the sawmill. Among them, accounts mention Henry Callum, 23, known for his dedication and a strange restlessness that, according to colleagues, began 2 weeks before the disappearance. They said Henry often stopped mid-shift, turned toward the Whitford Hills, and stood there, as if observing something invisible. He never commented on it, never explained the gesture. The teacher mentioned in the records, Arthur Hemsley, was a reserved but respected man. He taught mathematics and basic reading to the county's children. 4 days before he vanished, a student's mother saw him standing on the dirt road leading to the Whitford property. He wasn't walking, wasn't carrying books, didn't seem to have a destination. He simply remained still for a few minutes, looking at the closed gate. When the woman approached, he smiled politely and left without saying what he was doing there. In the weeks before the disappearance, several residents reported small changes in Eleanor Whitford's behavior. Nothing extraordinary, nothing alarming enough to be reported, just nuances that when combined form an uncomfortable mosaic. A neighbor, Samuel Doran, stated decades later that while passing on the road bordering the property, he heard wood being dragged in the Whitford basement around 5 in the morning. It wasn't the sound of stored goods, he said. It was the sound of construction. He never managed to explain why he was so certain of the difference, but his conviction remained unchanged through the years. Another testimony came from Marjorie Elms, who helped Eleanor with sewing and small household repairs. According to her, the widow appeared more fatigued than usual, with deep shadows under her eyes and the posture of someone who had spent nights awake. Still, Eleanor avoided long conversations and answered politely, though distantly. But the most intriguing account came from a boy of the time, Owen Gratch, then 12. He said in old age that he saw a row of fresh male footprints going down the trail toward the Whitford basement. And what struck him most was that there were only footprints going in, not coming back. When asked if he might have been mistaken, Owen repeated the same sentence in every interview. I saw 20, maybe 30 prints, all going in the same direction. It looked like no one came back. Despite these signs, no one in the county mentioned the widow or the basement publicly until the disappearances became impossible to ignore. Life continued in predictable, repetitive rhythm, typical of rural communities of the period. Markets operated on Tuesdays and Saturdays. The sawmill opened before dawn. Children ran through fields while adults tried to maintain supplies before winter. But the feeling of normality was not unanimous. In the personal notes of Edwin Thatch, the county's oldest blacksmith, there is mention of a tension in the air, felt mainly at dusk when the wind from the hills carried a distinct smell of damp earth, as if something underground had been disturbed. He wrote, "None of these details alone would raise suspicion, but together they suggest a subtle displacement in the county's routine, a change so faint it was only noticed when it was too late." There is also an account of an informal gathering at Black Hollow Tavern 2 days before the disappearance, where 3 loggers mentioned being instructed not to cut wood near the creek behind the Whitford property. The order came from a sawmill supervisor who, according to witnesses, received an anonymous letter recommending the area be avoided due to structural soil safety. No record of this letter has ever been found, but the claim was repeated by more than one person present that day. The morning before the disappearance, Eleanor was seen buying salt, grain, and several wooden planks at Brindleford's store. According to the shopkeeper, she was calm, though quieter than usual. She asked for the planks to be delivered that same day, and when he mentioned the approaching cold, she simply replied, "Yes, it's going to be a long winter." No one has ever determined exactly what she meant. What is known clearly is that Crowthorn Hollow's routine seemed to follow its natural course until, for reasons no record has ever conclusively explained, 27 men walked, each from a different point of the county to the same place, all toward the Whitford property, all toward a basement that officially should have contained nothing more than household tools and winter supplies. And the unsettling detail, highlighted by several of the last testimonies, is that no one reported seeing Eleanor Whitford outside her house that day, not even briefly. The disappearance of the 27 men occurred between late afternoon and early evening on October 28, 1884, a time when the county of Crowthorn Hollow typically plunged into early darkness. According to weather records of the period, winds blew from the north with uneven intensity, dragging damp leaves across the ground and making the windows of houses tremble in short intervals, like small warnings no one interpreted. The reconstruction of the men's last confirmed movements is based on testimonies gathered over decades, cross-checked times, and scattered notes. There is no single continuous narrative. There are fragments, echoes, loose points that, when stitched together, form a thin and deeply unsettling line toward the same destination. The first man seen walking toward the hills was Henry Callum. He left the sawmill area around 4:20 p.m., according to the supervisor's last record. He carried no tools, no heavy coat, no lantern. He simply crossed the clearing, past the fence post, and followed the trail leading south toward the Whitford property. Minutes later, two fellow loggers saw him disappear behind a fold in the terrain, walking with firm steps and steady rhythm. The second confirmed report came from a farmer named Jonas Reed, who said he saw three men, two young apprentices and the younger blacksmith, walking down the dirt road dividing his land. They did not speak to one another. They did not appear drunk, scared, or lost. They simply walked, as if following a precise yet silent instruction. Jonas tried calling them, but none responded. He assumed they were heading to the tavern. The direction, however, was different, east, toward the hills. At the same time, behind the Crowthorn Ridge school building, Arthur Hemsley stood still for a full minute before shutting the classroom door. He adjusted his tie twice, extinguished the lantern, and left the building with a rigidity that caught the attention of the only witness, a student who had returned to retrieve a forgotten notebook. She said the teacher looked focused on something distant, though he was simply walking down the road leading to the Whitford Valley. As the last daylight faded, more reports emerged. A neighbor saw the blacksmith brothers walking side by side toward the creek. A woman fetching water claimed she saw a group of 4 men crossing the sorghum field, walking in the same cadence, without conversation, without hesitation. Young Owen Gratch reported hearing heavy footsteps on the trail leading to the Whitford basement that same night. Not running steps, but slow, ordered, repeated ones, as if people were descending a sloped path carefully. These combined descriptions form a disquieting pattern. All seem to walk as if they already knew the way. Records indicate the sun disappeared completely at 5:42 p.m. The night fell without visible moonlight. Low clouds covered the sky with a thick, silent blanket. The few surviving witnesses said that from 6 p.m. onward, the entire county felt unnervingly still, as if every sound was being absorbed by the cold air before reaching human ears. At the Whitford property, however, 2 details gained importance. The first came from Samuel Doran, who around 6:15 p.m. saw a faint light escaping through the crack of the basement door. A soft, flickering, yellowish light, likely a lantern. He later remarked that he had never seen the basement lit at that hour. Strange, but not alarming. The second was the last confirmed clue before total disappearance: the delivery of the wooden planks. Store records from Brindleford note that a young delivery man named Elias Trent left the material at the back door of the Whitford house at 5:55 p.m. Years later, he stated that he knocked twice on the side door to announce the delivery, but no one answered. As he walked around the house, he noticed the basement door slightly open. From inside, he heard a muffled sound, a dull dragging, like wood being moved across the floor. He thought about calling out, but decided against it. He left the planks, mounted his horse, and returned to the store. This sound appears in 3 later testimonies, each describing it differently. Something heavy being pulled, wood hitting wood, a slow, repetitive, almost constant movement. None mention voices. From that point forward, the records become hollow. Between 6:30 and 7:10 p.m., no confirmed human presence was recorded on the main road, on the trail to Bracken Valley, or in the sorghum field. It was as if the wind swept all activity from the county for 40 minutes, too short to mean nothing, too long to ignore. The last testimony of the night came indirectly from Eleanor Whitford. A distant neighbor, Marjorie Elms, claimed to have seen the silhouette of a woman standing in the yard around 7:20 p.m. The figure was motionless, facing the house, as if waiting for something, or someone. It cannot be confirmed that it was Eleanor, but the posture, shape, and timing matched her routine. When Marjorie blinked to clear her eyes, the forming mist made droplets. The silhouette had disappeared. But what unsettles the most is not what was seen that night. It is what wasn't. No witness reported shouts, running calls for help, or group movement. No horses were found loose, no overturned lanterns, no dropped items of clothing. The only physical evidence noted the next morning was the presence of many footprints leading down the trail to the basement, and none returning. The door, according to the first residents who arrived at the property the next morning, was shut, not locked, just resting against the frame, as if someone planned to return within minutes. The researcher paid special attention to the basement's interior. Old reports describe a damp space, uneven stone walls, shelves with supplies, and basic carpentry tools. But what stood out, according to a 1902 document, was the total absence of disturbance. No signs of a struggle, no broken objects, no evidence that 27 men had been there at the same time. And still, that basement was the last confirmed location. What happened between 6 and 7:30 p.m. was never fully reconstructed. Conflicting accounts suggest some men may have arrived earlier than others, some alone, others in pairs, but no document mentions noise that would indicate a gathering. The historiographic reconstruction offers a final point for the chapter. By around 7:40 p.m., all lanterns in the house were extinguished. The Whitford property was in complete silence. No shadow was seen afterward, and none of the 27 men returned home that night. The final detail, one that remains unexplained even after 140 years, comes from a short note written by one of the searchers the next day. We found boot prints by the basement door, many, but only one female print beside them. Curiously, that single print pointed outward. When the sun finally broke through the heavy fog the next morning, the absence of the 27 men ceased to be a distant unease and became a brutal certainty. The first households to notice were those closest to the sawmill, where the morning routine began before daylight. At 6:10 a.m., supervisors realized half the team hadn't appeared. 15 minutes later, farmers in the eastern fields reported their helpers hadn't returned for the late harvest. And shortly before 7, the wife of blacksmith Andrew Hemsley went out to the road, distressed, asking if anyone had seen her husband, unaware that dozens of other families felt the same fear at that very moment. The news spread as if carried by the cold wind slicing through the hills. Within 2 hours, 20 residents had already gathered in front of the Whitford house. Not out of direct suspicion, but because, when overlapping the last sightings, that point became the only possible link among so many different paths. The basement door was resting in place exactly as it had been the night before. When they finally opened it, the creak of the hinge echoed through the property like a belated warning. Inside, the space looked untouched. The packed earth floor was intact, the shelves organized, the lantern extinguished on the side table. No mud, no blood, no drag marks, no clothes, no ropes, no recent footprints, absolutely nothing. According to the note written by searcher Jonathan Harrell in November 1884, the absence of traces was more disturbing than any sign of struggle could have been. Search efforts extended for days, first through the hills, then through the trails leading to Bracken Valley, and finally along the creek running through the county. Improvised teams used lanterns, ropes, and trained dogs, but found nothing but silence. The terrain showed no signs of landslides, fissures, or unstable areas that could have swallowed such a large group. The forest was untouched, as if no one had passed through it. Still, some fragments began to surface, not as concrete clues, but as small cracks in the official narrative. The first came from Owen Gratch, the boy who had seen only outgoing footprints on the trail to the basement. He returned to the site 2 days later with the adults, and insisted there were fewer footprints than before. The men attributed it to wind, light rain, and the trampling of search teams. But Owen insisted that wasn't it, that some prints had vanished completely, as if they had never existed. The second fragment came from a letter written by Arthur Hemsley, discovered 42 years later, wedged between the pages of an arithmetic book from the school. It is unknown when he wrote it, only that it was before the disappearance. The text says, "There is something I must resolve before winter arrives, something I left pending for far too long. It has nothing to do with my students, but with a promise made the year Thomas Whitford died. I hope that when I return, everything will finally be balanced." The letter ends there. No further explanation. The third fragment came from Marjorie Elms, the neighbor who helped Eleanor with sewing. In a testimony recorded in 1899, she revealed something she had never said officially. She claimed that, a week before the disappearance, she found Eleanor sitting at the edge of her bed, holding a pair of very worn men's gloves. When asked if they belonged to her late husband, Eleanor simply replied, "They were left here." When Marjorie asked by whom, Eleanor did not answer. When combining these fragments, some researchers began to wonder whether there was a common thread among the 27 missing men. Jobs, routines, families, nothing matched. However, nearly half of them shared one detail: they had all participated at some point in the rebuilding attempt of the bridge, where Thomas Whitford was crushed 2 years earlier. There is no document suggesting a direct relationship between this event and the disappearance. But in a small community, tragedies plant long roots and subterranean memories. The search for Eleanor Whitford became a parallel priority. At first, residents believed she might be injured or missing along with the men. But as hours passed, it became clear that she had simply left. No clothes were missing, no bags prepared, no food removed from the pantry. Only the absence of the widow herself, as if she had stepped out for a few minutes and never returned. A farmer claimed to have seen a woman walking alone on the northern road the following morning, shortly after 8. He could not confirm whether it was Eleanor, as the figure wore a dark shawl hiding part of her face. She walked slowly, carrying nothing. The farmer continued his route and never saw her again. Though treated cautiously, this testimony later became crucial to the case's final reconstruction. Among the 1901 archives, there is a report mentioning an annotation found inside the Whitford basement, not during the first searches, but years later when the property was abandoned. Written in pencil on a floorboard, it contained only 3 words: "I tried to warn." The handwriting, according to later analysis, matches Eleanor Whitford's. There is no context, no explanation, no named recipient. But one final detail, one that offers no answers, yet changes the emotional shape of the case, remains. When examining the footprints registered the day after the disappearance, the researcher found a previously ignored pattern. The single female footprint pointing outward was not alone. Beside it, in a parallel line, there was another mark, barely noticeable yet clear upon careful inspection. A child's footprint, also pointing outward, also unique, with no corresponding pair to justify it. And with that, the silence of the case did not merely deepen, it became permanent. Some cases survive time not because they are grand, but because they remain unfinished. The disappearance of the 27 men of Crowthorn Hollow belongs to that category. A story that never found its final point, only replaced old questions with deeper gaps. Revisiting this episode more than a century later is like walking along a partially erased trail. There are marks here and there, but between them lies an emptiness no historian has managed to fill. Official records remain scarce. The county changed its name at the turn of the century. Part of the population dispersed after the harsh winter of 1885, and the Whitford house was abandoned a few years later. Today, only remnants of the original structure remain. 2 leaning walls, wood blackened by time, and what is left of the basement where so many questions intersect and no answer holds. The researcher who wrote the final reconstruction described in his concluding report the feeling of walking through the property on an autumn afternoon. He said the wind there is different, not colder, not stronger, just more present, as if it moved through the land with a silent awareness, touching leaves, stones and wood with the same care used to touch a fragile object. He wrote that when stopping in front of the old basement's opening, he felt the same discomfort mentioned in the accounts of the time. Not fear, but the impression that something had been interrupted before reaching its end. A kind of unfinished rite, or a promise that never found a place to be fulfilled. Nothing supernatural, just the sort of silence that settles when many lives are abruptly affected and no one knows why. Revisiting the notes, letters and testimonies reveals that Eleanor Whitford was never fully understood by chroniclers of the period. Some saw her as a woman scarred by loss. Others perceived her as too reserved for such an interconnected community. And some, decades later, speculated about her role in the collective disappearance, but always based on fragile fragments, never on facts. Yet, when putting all accounts together, a more human and less sensational hypothesis emerges. Eleanor knew something was wrong long before the night of October 28th. She didn't know what, didn't know how to stop it, didn't know who was involved. But the phrase found on the basement floorboard, likely written in haste, suggests she carried alone a warning no one was prepared to hear. The presence of the child's footprint beside the female footprint reinforces this ambiguity. No one knows who that child was. There are no records of visits that night. No child went missing in connection with the case. The footprint simply exists, like a loose thread on the edge of an already worn fabric. Trying to interpret it led the researcher to conclude that in cases like this, some questions endure because they were born from silence. There are no witnesses capable of recounting what they did not understand, nor documents capable of capturing what was never seen. The story of Crowthorn Hollow is therefore not a narrative of revelation, but a narrative of absence, and it is in this absence that its weight resides. Families of the time continued as best they could, some leaving the county, others rebuilding routines intertwined with grief and uncertainty. New generations grew up hearing fragments of the story, trying to fill the empty space the documents did not. In his conclusion, the researcher wrote, "When I sift through these files, I'm not looking for culprits. I'm trying to understand why some events leave marks that time cannot erase. Perhaps it's because we never truly close them. Perhaps because they carry something we are still trying to explain." He ends his report with a simple moment, the instant he stood to leave the property after his last day of research. As he walked down the trail, he instinctively turned back toward the basement. Not out of expectation, not out of fear, but out of recognition, as if that place, despite everything, was still waiting for something. The wind crossed the trail in the same direction noted in the 1884 record. The leaves moved in the same way. The late afternoon light struck the aged wood as if time had not passed. And there, before a landscape that seemed to repeat an old gesture, the researcher wrote his final line, not in the official report, but in his personal notebook. Some stories do not disappear, they keep breathing in the space left by those who left. And after that he closed the notebook and wrote nothing more.